Hello and welcome to this webinar. Today we have a guest speaker, Jason Covey, who will be giving an interesting presentation on the key points when importing and exporting load files. But before we start, I want to mention that on May 19, the next webinar topic is on USB forensics with W4. If you're interested in that webinar, you can find more information and you can register for the webinar on our website. I'll now hand it over to Jason to proceed with his presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon. My name is Jason Covey. I am Digital Forensics and E-Discovery Manager with Morris, Manning & Martin in Atlanta, Georgia. We provide an in-house e-discovery and digital forensics operation in support of our litigation practice group, which is about a 60-person team across 4 offices. We use both the Intella desktop software and the Intella Connect review platform as our flagship in-house tool. I have been an Intella user since about 2011 and version 1.5, and I have worked in law firm civil litigation since about 2002 in various capacities. I would like to thank my colleague Alexandra Sudler at Morris Manning, who assisted me with putting this presentation together. So what are load files? That's kind of the million-dollar question for the uninitiated. What load files are specially formatted text files, and their purpose is to facilitate transferring data among different database platforms. They're kind of a common language, if you will. They exist in multiple formats to serve different types of purposes, and different e-discovery databases that prefer different formats, but what they do is provide a universal link to externally linked document images, text files, and native files, as well as metadata fields. They're very conceptually similar to spreadsheets, but the main difference is they're not bound by limitations that come into play with spreadsheets, such as per character text, character counts in cells, or limitations with row or column limits. I often refer to, when I'm explaining to folks, I refer to load files as a database to go, because it gives you the ability to take voluminous content and put it in a to-go package that can be removed from one database via an export and successfully imported into a destination database, and if done successfully, nothing is lost. A note about load files, and this is part of, I think, what makes them confusing. There is no universal naming convention really for anything about load files. There can be numerous names for the same field that refer to the same thing. The same field name can mean something different in a different context. A lot of times it's specific to an organization or perhaps a platform, so kind of you're always well served to look at examples in the context of the discussion to before you proceed, to just kind of check yourself and make sure you're understanding or not misunderstanding or misinterpreting a name. I would say, as a general rule, always be guided by the content, the data that you're seeing on the screen, rather than the name of a field. Common load file formats. So the dominant load file formats are the concordance or relativity .dat format. You'll commonly hear this referred to in the industry as a DAT file. And the purpose of DAT files is to house fielded metadata as well as links to usually external text files as well as native files. An Opticon file is for organizing the associated document images that may have been created and keeping those organized so that they can be externally linked to the database record. These two have kind of become the de facto standard in e-discovery, and that's mainly as a result of Relativity having adopted them as its standard formats for load files and being a dominant player in the industry as a review platform. For an honorable mention is the LFP file, which is an alternative to the Opticon that sees some use, but it's a lot less limited. I've included a link there so you can find out more about it. But The DAT and the Opticon are what we're going to focus on today, and I think are what you'll encounter in 95% or more of incoming and outgoing document productions in deliverables worldwide. Let's talk first about the image file format, which is kind of a common point of confusion about what's required and supported by different platforms. Generally speaking, PDF files are not considered a valid image format for use with a production deliverable, although you sure see them a lot, which contributes to the confusion. The reason we don't use PDFs generally is because of issues related to file size. They're more complex to render, and they have a multi-page format. So there are some reasons that make them undesirable in some instances for use as a database image format. Instead, TIFF files dominate, and in legal use, the standard imaging specification is 300 dpi black and white TIFF with group 4 compression. Intella is a little bit different in this regard in that it offers additional flexibility, of which I'm a big fan, in being able to accommodate PDFs as an image format. And that's a notable exception versus most software which deals with PDF as a native file format. In addition, Intella can also accommodate other image file formats, including TIFF, JPEG, and PNG. I wanted to make a special note that it so happens that Intella's internal image format for load files is PDF, such that if you're dealing with Intella, you should always request PDF format as an image format when you're going to be loading a production into Intella. TIFF images will also work for that, but they require PDF conversion, so this actually saves you a step in doing that. Color. Color is an issue that comes up when we're talking about image file formats in a document production. One of the things that you'll hear about is preserving color or color for color, meaning that color content is preserved. And this kind of can create a little a point of contention between Intella and relativity, because the official relativity image specification stipulates black and white TIFF content. Black and white content should be rendered in TIFF format, and then color content should be included in JPEG format, such that if you've got a 5-page document and the first 4 pages are black and white, but there's a color graphic on the 5th page, that 5th image should technically be provided in JPEG format. Intella does not currently support any type of color content detection across all content types, so I wanted to include a few workarounds, because this can be something that you encounter in the real world, and it can sometimes sound dire and that there are no solutions, and that's actually not the case. One option is to provide an all JPEG production instead, which inherently accommodates color for color. That can absolutely be loaded directly into Intella without any issues, and I've done that many times in real world cases. And that's just with JPEG selected as your image format at time of export, it takes care of that issue. Another option is to provide, if there's, usually it's not across the whole document collection, there's particular content that color is critical. That can be dealt with by providing the native files for those items only. And then another option is to provide duplicate, I have images and quotes in PDF format, such that the receiving party can re-image whatever color content is deemed worthy of the additional effort, so that it's rendered in color format. And that can be done by providing PDF files for that subset of items only. Load file terminology. As I said earlier, there's no consistent real naming convention, so there isn't much of a glue to hold the subject of load files together. This is one area where most of what exists as far as common threads in referring to load file terminology exists on this slide. So we have a concept of a relative path. That's new to people that maybe don't have much experience with load files, and a relative path is defined simply as the path information that completes the path to the destination content relative to the location of the source. And we're going to look at what that specifically means later on. So basically, if our load file is in a specific location, the path information that exists in our native and external text files is meant to be in relative to the location of the load file itself. And like I said, we're going to have a visual representation of that later on in the presentation. The alternative to that are hard-coded paths, and that's what we're used to. That's like if a document is located in C, user, name, documents and settings, that type of thing. Delimiters are special text characters that we define from the outset, and I've included a screenshot for what that looks like in Intella, that define boundaries between fields as well as specific content within fields. Those can generally be defined, and kind of the default definitions that you'll most commonly see in litigation load file productions are shown on the screen. Text encoding is another issue that can arise in dealing with load files. I'll just briefly say that text encoding generally needs to match with Intella across your Opticon, your DAT, and your externally linked text files. My recommendation would be to always go with UTF-8 whenever possible so that everything matches in UTF-8, and that helps avoid any kind of issues. The concept of a link field in load files, that is a means with which to match disparate data and overlay them. You'll see that overlay is the next term in the list. So what that is, it's just a common field. So if you have an item ID listed that is a unique identifier for records in one field, if you want to overlay additional metadata to extend what Bound refers to as the data model, you have to have a common field, and the link field serves that purpose. And we'll look at where that is in the later in the presentation. And then just the concept of field mapping is just where you direct fields to appear, and we'll look at that as well. This is self-explanatory, but I wanted to include this because I can't emphasize enough how important preparation is in anything load files. That is the basis for success. Bound drops hints in several locations throughout Intella and Intella Connect. Heed these warnings. This is good advice, and it's included there for a reason. It's meant to help you stop, pause, and look at your circumstances, and I've added some of my own later on that we'll address as well. Successful project preparation. In general, to summarize this slide, it's just ensuring communication, because particularly in the e-discovery world, the technical personnel that need to be communicating in order to ensure a successful exchange of information via load files, I've found over my decade plus of doing this that those folks rarely communicate directly, and that is usually the source of all problems. End users, even though they're stakeholders in the project, don't really appreciate the importance of this, the complexity of what's involved in load file deliverables, and just kind of it's something that's in the back of their mind, and they don't see it as their problem. So to the extent possible, when you can be aggressive in facilitating this communication, one of the lawyers I work for has a philosophy of you've got to let the technical personnel communicate. They have a way of solving problems because they speak the same language. In the case of load files, we're probably the only two personnel in the project that do speak the same language. So the ability to communicate is key, because you can anticipate problems weeks out, such that when the exchange of data actually occurs, it's smooth and seamless and there are no problems, and everything's already been worked out in advance. Again, read the Bound user manual, particularly in its most current version. It's the best it's ever been in including a lot of ancillary information that gets you thinking about the context and a lot of clues about things to think about ahead of time. This is one of my common sayings of anyone that's heard me speak about this. There's two kinds of load files, perfect and broken. And we can all guess which is the one that we need for successful load file import and exchange of information. So the reality of working with load files is that despite your best preparation and effort, there's virtually almost never a time that what you receive is absolutely perfect and ready to go right out of the gate. And that's a shock to some people but it shouldn't be, because that's the reality of working with load files. I have received broken load files from many of the largest organizations that traverse the world of e-discovery, and they have to be fixed. There's human beings creating these things, and they make mistakes, they forget things. There's hundreds of settings involved and lots of different pieces of software, and mistakes are made. And at that point, that the ship has sailed, and it generally becomes the most expedient thing to fix the problem yourself rather than go back to the other side. So that's why I want to talk a little bit about the need to edit and develop some advanced text editing skills outside of Intella that really aren't about Intella, that resolve these issues, which are usually minor and can be fixed in 5 minutes, at which point you're good to go, and the problem's behind you. Included on the screen are a list of some text editors and different software that are capable. These are basically what folks in the industry are using to perform this type of editing, that go from free to expensive and different capabilities. My advice is to pick one of these and learn it, because it's going to empower you in dealing with load files and resolving problems. So I've just added a hypothetical scenario here. Imagine you've got an export of 500,000 documents with over 200,000 records. It's taken all weekend to run, and then all of a sudden you get new information on 9 a.m. at the time the production's due, and it's got to be addressed. At that point, this is when you have to rely on these skills, because there isn't time to fix the problem any other way. In editing load files, always make a backup first. You never want to be in a situation where you've destroyed your pristine copy of the file to where you've edited it and leave yourself with no ability to correct the problem. That's a self-inflicted wound and a very avoidable mistake, so always think about that. When I'm training new people to deal with this, that's the first thing I tell them: create a copy before you do anything, because you've got to leave yourself a trail of breadcrumbs to correct any issue. Working with load file sources in Intella, one of the things I think is kind of conceptually confusing for new folks or people that are familiar with Intella but aren't necessarily familiar with load files, is that there's a whole set of fields that are only available, that I'm calling load file specific fields, that are only available at the time of export from Intella. So I know in the early years of my working with this, that wasn't 100% clear to me. So there are some examples of those types of fields on screen. And then we're going to go to the next page, which actually shows these fields and where they reside when you're setting up fields available for export. So although the Intella column item is where you can see Intella's internal fields that you're most familiar with, such as URI, message hash, what Intella calls the location field, things that are specific to Intella, there's all these other fields that you don't see at any other time. And the reason is they really only exist or serve a purpose within the context of a load file. So that's why they're existed here. So Bound is making these available for inclusion in your load files at the time of export, so that we can create that concept of the to-go database that we discussed. Common issues in importing load file sources. The vast majority of issues with importing has to do with date formats. So Bound has been kind enough to include this pop-up quick reference option menu that you can take a look at and see how date and time formats are addressed within the syntax that Intella uses. Can't encourage you enough to become very familiar with this, because these are very minor distinctions that are made, and these resolve most of the issues that you encounter. So becoming familiar with this, experimenting with it in the software, looking at it in the context of a load, and seeing what effect it makes is highly encouraged. Another common issue with load file sources that I wanted to show a specific example of. One of the things is the lack of a consistent or definitive identifier field for email. This is where the way relativity handles it comes to mind. Relativity deals with identifying email by leaving the file extension field blank. So essentially a blank field means load file. Well, Intella doesn't necessarily like that. Intella is looking for something else. So there may be a time where you have to edit the load file that you've received, which is technically perfect for relativity. That's not going to work in Intella unless you tell Intella what field to use to identify it as a load file. So one option is to ask for a custom field in your production spec that identifies email items. And I think one of the things that's commonly misunderstood is that when we're dealing with load files, the way it's supposed to work is your production specification that you share with the other side is to communicate to them the technical specifications that they need to meet in providing data to you. We're not all required to use the same software technology, and it's reciprocal, and they're going to require some things that are specific for their tool that you may have to accommodate. So that concept gets missed a lot, particularly in e-discovery where it's an adversarial relationship and the need to cooperate is overlooked at times. Let's take a look at the specific example I'm showing here. This is a very common problem. So when we look at the sample field where a native path field in the DAT from a single line of the native link field, we see natives / 001 / and then we've got the name of an individual email. The way that path exists, when what it's communicating there is the location that the DAT field needs to be in the relative path. So this is where I said earlier in the presentation we're going to visualize it. So if we take ABC _ and we see our DAT file in the screenshot on the left, and then we see the natives path back in our field, we see that natives folder is right there. Within that natives folder is the 001 subfolder, and within that is the ABC 009 email. So when you see the native path constructed in that manner, I like to say that it's what the software is looking for south of, so to speak, the load file. So you can see that regardless of where that load file is, the path information of wherever that is on your computer does not matter. It only matters the organization of the folders and files south of that point. And that's where we see that natives folder. So with something that's kind of specific of relativity, that's what's in the right screenshot. There are many times that someone will be trying to load a load file production and says, well, this doesn't work, the path, something's wrong with this, the load file's broken. Well, what's happening is the same native path that you're seeing on the screen is expecting that load file to be in that root directory. We can see on the example on the right, it's not there. In fact, in this case, it's in the data folder. That data folder is commonly used. So even though that native path reflects the DAT file being in the root location, in root directory of this particular level of the folders, is not there, therefore it's not going to work. On the next screen, and maybe some of you have seen this, this is what it's going to look like in Intella when you try to validate your load file. So we're seeing here that Intella is looking for those paths, but it can't find it because we've got that data folder in the middle, and it's saying to you this is what's in the path, but we're not finding any of these files, and that's because that the load file doesn't need to be in that data folder. So to go back a slide, literally relocating that DAT file back out of the data folder at the level it's supposed to be and restoring and correcting the nesting fixes it. So that's an important concept. That's probably the most common thing I see, and folks frustrated, pulling their hair out trying to get it to load for them. This is the relatively new dialog for mapping the fields to where they display within Intella. It's excellent. You should become familiar with it. This slide deals with a capability that Intella has to actually reprocess data when native data is provided. A lot of times you'll receive load files that are missing important fields that you need. However, in some cases, you've been provided the native files. Intella has a very unique capability to address and basically restore this information as if it was processed in Intella by introducing Intella's processing routine to the import process. Issues with exporting with load files. Templates are very helpful. They can also be a source of problems if they're not accurate. We'll make extensive use of templates. I'm about to show you some of what that looks like. Some of these are basically common sense tips that are also reflected in the manual, so I'll refer you to the Intella manual to see what some of those are. And just setting expectations, planning ahead, communication. There's really no secrets or anything in addition I have to add beyond what's in the Intella manuals, but just emphasizing some of that here. Additional considerations. These are things that are specific to e-discovery, that are about the need to re-OCR, whether you're going to have empty text files, and QC to ensure that privileged content isn't included when you're included by mistake when you're producing native files. This is another big piece of advice that I really want to emphasize. Whenever you're exporting anything from Intella, always, always, always include the CSV export. This can help you save problems because it freezes the user actions in time via the metadata that's recorded in the CSV file. You can use all the formats you want, but the CSV file is immediately able to be manipulated in software and solve problems. So that's why it's so important that you include that. It's one checkbox. There's no downside in including it. So I cannot emphasize enough the need. That's something that we teach internally whenever I'm training anyone to work with Intella. Always create that CSV file because it creates a very unique record of what you exported in a way that's not otherwise possible. Imagine, for example, if you're familiar with Intella's export sets, sometimes we make mistakes and changes have to be made to export sets, and an export set can actually be deleted. Well, your export set is deleted, and that's an irreversible action in Intella. Once that's gone, there's no referring to it anymore. However, if you save the CSV file on the back end in your export location, you still have that to go back to look at something, because sometimes you might delete something and then realize in a subsequent process in the task you're engaging in that you really shouldn't have deleted it, and you need to know more about what was included. This is a way to solve and freeze in time and solve a problem like that. So that is one of the best tips I can share. All right, let's move on to a quick demonstration of these processes in Intella. So I have a small data set loaded into Intella, and we're going to perform a load file export. I'm going to take this content that has been tagged as responsive. I'm going to recall it, and we have this ready to go. So I'm going to select all of the content, and we are going to export selection, which is going to bring up Intella's dialog, series of dialogues to set up and define your load file export. You can see we have load file selected. Another thing that I highly recommend is always creating an export set. There's no reason not to. There's all kinds of advantages and no disadvantages, so I highly recommend doing that. So we're going to proceed. Here is Bound's very prescient list of warnings and things to consider in performing a load file export. So we're going to go through this dialog, and I've set this up with a template, so basically everything's ready to go. These are some common settings that we use for most of our productions, which are going to be similar to what you're going to want to use in most e-discovery context. So we've used the custom file naming for a 6-digit counter with a prefix separated by an underscore. It's very important to have that box checked. It's not checked by default, so you definitely want to include that. Moving forward, we're going to look at the load file options dialog. Here we have it set up to have our images exported in TIFF format. Bound fairly recently included the ability to also export your images as PDF. So I always keep this enabled because it gives you the flexibility of having both formats, and it creates them automatically. It's just a tiny bit of additional disk space, so there's really no reason not to do it. In this case, we have TIFF set up as our primary image format with 300 DPI in the group 4 encoding we talked about. We're not including all natives. That's in e-discovery context where you're doing a finalized document production. That's usually the case. I've also set up some custom time and date formats. Moving on, what you can see here is that I have taken the time to set up in advance, which I highly recommend, basically all of Entellus fields. So this includes at the top these load file specific fields. I'm going to go take a look at those. Sorry, it's popping up on my other screen. So this is showing us those load file specific fields that only show up in the context of creating a load file. So that's basically these items that are listed in the main view. IntelliColumn is the exception, which unlocks the ability to include Entellus internal fields. I happen to have created a custom field called responsiveness that's actually there it is. I'm going to include that here just on the fly. I'm going to label it. And I'm going to include that in my export. You can see by doing that, it's just popped up. And the checkbox is included at the end. The reason I'm an advocate for including all these fields is not that you're always going to use them. It's that you want to have them available because it's much easier. This is time consuming to set all this up. But once you have it and it's reusable as a template, if we don't want to use these fields, it's as quick as deselecting them. That's much, much, much quicker than going through and adding each one and trying to create a custom setup every time. So we're just going to keep everything selected and proceed. These are generally the settings that I use when performing a load file export. And if you'll see, for the email rendering view, these are the settings that, in my experience, kind of make the email look most like what you're used to seeing in an email client like Outlook, which is generally what people are expecting to see in document image formats. You can see this is a step that a lot of people miss, and they'll often have exported file name and not have their Bates numbers appear. You want page name because that provides page level numbering, aka Bates numbering, such that each page of every image exported has a unique identifier included. I'm going to click next. We're going to blow through these settings that are already correct. There's that all-important CSV file field selected so that we'll create that log. And I'm now going to run the export. This gives you a final check to check out your settings and summarize them, go back and make any changes. And feel free to go back. Don't commit to this because the bigger the production, the bigger risk you're taking and making sure these settings are correct. So by all means, this is the time to pause, reflect, pour over everything, second guess yourself, quadruple check. This is the time to do it. I'm now going to click Start Export, and Intella is going to get going on running this small 28 document production. So what Intella is doing here, it's exporting the records, and then that 3 of 11 images you're seeing on the screen, that's kind of the background conversion that's taking place from your PDF images to the duplicate TIFF images. In some real-world testing that I've done in performing some very large productions, including of late, we had a production that was about 650,000 pages. I have clocked Intella generating images at a rate of somewhere between, let's call it 75,000 pages per hour. So with its multi-threading capability and its image generation engine, it's just astronomically powerful in creating those exports. So we can see here, we've got our folder, we have our relative, our 2 load files that are located relative to the proper locations of the files that are linked inside. Here we can see that we have our TIFF images, our single-page TIFF images, we have our multi-page PDF images. Everything is right where it's supposed to be. And we have our extracted text files. So what I want to do here, I do need to close real quick. I'm going to open the other database where this is ready to import. Okay, so I'm going to move it over. So I'm going to go to sources, add new. We're going to pick a load file. And here we are going to navigate out to the locations I've saved these. So I'm going to grab my DAT file, and you can see I've dutifully prepared the copy of the load file. I follow my own advice because anyone is susceptible to making a mistake here. And we're going to grab the corresponding Opticon file. And once you add the DAT file, Intella with this ellipse remembers the same path looking for the Opticon file. Pro tip, if you want to rename the source, this is where you do it. We typically name ours by production baits range, but if you don't want that file extension to appear, you can delete it there. I'm going to click next, and we're going to see that everything's worked properly. Our delimiters are set and we're identified automatically, and we have a preview of the approximately 100 fields in our load file. This previewer is a fantastic addition to Intella that did not used to always exist, and is a great built-in tool that allows you to preview the content of the file. So we can see it snaps everything into columns for you. Everything's visible. You can get an overview of the entirety of the incoming content. So that gives you a view of basically how the software is going to see and interpret the load file. If we click on the image preview tab, we can see that our images are displaying properly in this previewer. As a tip, if you are importing PDF images, this image previewer does not support display of a PDF because it's technically not an image file type. That is not a problem. So, and Bound actually leaves a little warning here for us under this suggesting it's not supported for the image format. So if it's a PDF, it's perfectly fine that you're loading multi-page PDF as the image format. So don't let that throw you off that the preview isn't displaying. That's only going to work for TIFF, JPEG, and PNG. If we move to the text preview, this gives you more of a view of what the text of a load file actually looks like in an external text editor, like one of the ones I recommended. So Bound has been nice enough to make this very convenient and build this in to the import, so it gives you a lot more visibility, versus having to understand these things conceptually when you can't see any of them. I've already set up our date and time formats properly, so let's move on to the next field. This is where we set up our mapping, and let's see, it looks like it's not honoring my template, so let me go ahead and add my template back real quick. And we can see now that all this long list of things is populated. Hopefully that was self-explanatory in communicating the value of a template. This is where I've created the email identifier field. I've created a special field that I usually create by default that's called isEmail, and make it a true-false field with the value as true for that being an email file to always identify emails. This is where we select the native path, the path to externally linked native files, and then the text path for linked text files. This differentiates between whether it's a link to an external text file, because an alternative, although it's much more rarely used these days, is to embed the text into a field in the load file itself. That's generally frowned upon, so I would avoid that and always go with the externally linked files. This is the option we discussed earlier where Intella gives you this unique capability to reprocess native data that may have been provided to improve on deficiencies in the load file that you might have received. This is a fantastic tool and gives Intella a lot of flexibility. Moving ahead, I'm going to show you how to map one field. If I have done this correctly, I should see my responsiveness field somewhere, but I don't want to take much time to look for it, so if I don't see it right off the bat, we'll just skip it. You know what, I might not have included that at the time I created this. So let's go ahead and check for errors. We can see that no errors are found. The biggest reason this is the case is because we took our time, used templates, followed all the rules that I presented in this presentation, at which point we are ready to go, and I'm going to process this load file. This should take just a few seconds, so if there's any questions that have come in, we can field those. If not, we'll take a quick look at this and we will conclude today's presentation.
Still no questions
Remember,
yet, Jason. I think you're doing a very good job.
okay, fantastic. So earlier in the presentation, I said there's two kinds of load files, broken or perfect. The part of what tells you they need to be perfect is when you are loading a load file source, we always need to see 0 exceptions. There cannot be errors on a properly loaded load file source. So that's a clue that something has gone wrong if you start seeing exceptions. Now, granted, with the process that Bound has built in, you'll typically find those things ahead of time, but we'll see it's very quickly processing our load file with 28 records, and it is finished in a blazing 51 seconds. Let's go take a quick look under the location facet. We can see the name of our export. We can see that Intella has faithfully recreated the folder path of our source data. Let's go ahead and pull up the documents that are in the production. One thing I wanted to point out to you is that when you're loading a load file into Intella into an empty case, the load file itself should always appear as item ID 0, and then the records always load in the order that they're listed in the load file by document ID. So let's quickly add the document ID field so we can see that and prove that. We can see that our Bates number doc ID, I've clicked hide irrelevant to suppress the load file itself as because it's categorized in Intella as an irrelevant item, and we can see that these numbers do match and are displaying everything sequentially. And let's just take a quick look and open a record. And let's take a look at the Images tab, which gives us a view of the document image, and we can see that our Bates number is right where it's supposed to be. Let's go to the next record. We see number 2, and then let's quickly go into the Raw Data tab, and we see preserved here. Here's everything that was in the load file. And what's really interesting is that even if you don't map a field, Intella still preserves them here. So sometimes a more technical user might need capabilities or search capabilities that a regular reviewer might not need. But with Intella's search capability to limit your searches to only the raw data field, it's possible to perform searches that are only on these items. I think with that, there are a couple limitations that exist in Intella that are pretty minor in terms of overlays, and we talked about color detection, and this first one is with regard to sort state. Other than that, I think I have gone just a bit over on my time. I knew this would be a challenge to discuss this complicated a subject in this short amount of time with this much information, but hopefully this has been valuable for you, and we have done our best. I'm happy to field any questions, and if any attendees have questions later that they think of that they want to submit, Bound will pass those along to me. I'll be happy to answer any of those as well. With that, I will turn it over to John to conclude today's presentation.
Thanks, Jason. That was really good, really informative, a lot of information in there. Currently, we have no questions. So as Jason says, if anyone does have any questions, then link back up with Jacqueline and she can pass them on. Other than that, I'd like to once again thank Jason for the presentation and coming along to present for us. Everyone else, have a great day. Thank you very much for attending.